I'm Jono, and in this video we're going to look at how we can use a sidechain input into Sculpture. But first we need to know what Sculpture is. Now Sculpture is a pretty unique instrument within Logic. We're aware of the fact that RetroSynth and the ESM and the ESP and the ES1 and the ES2 are all synthesizers, and they behave like synthesizers do. They allow us to build sounds from oscillators using harmonics, and we have filter control, and we have the ability just to kind of construct synthesized sounds in a way that Bob Moog sort of first really introduced to the world in the 1960s. What Sculpture is nothing like that at all. This is effectively what we refer to as a physical modelling instrument. What it does is to effectively present us with a string, and what we can do is to get that string moving in a number of different ways. Now, if you think about the real world for a moment, we know that stringed instruments like violins and violas exist, but we also know that there are guitars. And we also know that if we were to take, I don't know, let's say a kind of tube of glass or a wine glass, and we were to flick it in some way, we also know that it would produce a sound. In other words, what we have is kind of resonating instruments which have a kind of string running through them, which allow us to generate sounds that way. Now, Sculpture allows us to build sounds for a number of kind of imagined string starts. And in the middle, what we have is this material square, which allows us to build our string out of nylon or wood or glass or steel. And as we move around this, we can morph between those different properties. And you can see that over on the right-hand side, the string tension or size changes. So for example, if we were to build a string out of glass, it would be thicker than a string built out of nylon. So the first thing that we're seeing as we move around this area is that we're sort of seeing the string overall changing in terms of its kind of component qualities, if you like. But how are we actually going to get our string moving? Again, a bit like a violin, I can either bow a violin string, or I can pluck it, or I can pick at it in various ways. And what we allow ourselves to do when we work with Sculpture is to think about various ways in which we could get our virtual string moving. Now, what we can do is to choose a type of approach to getting our string moving from a drop-down menu. And at the moment, you can see that Object 1 is the one that's selected here, which allows me to decide how I want to get my string moving. And up to 3 objects can work on a string at once. Let's make life easy and just stick with one for a moment. So at the moment, I'm using what's called an impulse. Literally, I'm striking this string in some way. And when I play a note, we're now hearing a kind of virtual glass string being struck with this impulse kind of algorithm, if you like. And as I move around the material square, it's going to take on the properties of different types of string as I move around. So this is going to take us up towards a wood string, and then across to nylon, then down to steel. That sounds a bit more like a nylon string guitar. Okay, so we're hearing those different properties as we move around this area. Now then, you might be thinking, okay, yeah, but what is this whole display? Well, we've already established that the green line through the middle is the string itself, and we can see that object number 1 is kind of represented here by this number 1 tag. So what are we doing? Well, we've actually got 2 little pickups, if you like, for how this string might interact with the ways in which it's struck. And again, think about electric guitars for a moment, the idea of using pickups in that regard. So what I can do is to place a pickup somewhere along the line of the string. Now again, think about violins for a moment. If I've got the whole length of a violin string and I put a violin under my chin and I start to bow it, I'm bowing it towards one end of the string rather than right in the middle. If the string is going to vibrate, it's going to be at its widest point in the middle. So if I was kind of bowing it at that point, it would sound very different to being in some way bowed or struck or plucked at one end of the string, giving the whole idea of how the string is going to then behave, a sort of different behaviour moving forwards. And so the same thing is true here. As I move the kind of pickup points along the length of the string, or where exactly the objects kind of stimulate the string, get it moving in some way, again, the sound's going to change. So you can see that we get these kind of tonal shape characteristics. Now, the next thing we can do with Sculpture is to start thinking about actually having this string move by two objects getting it moving rather than just one. So if I was to turn on the object light for number 2, what I then need to do is to decide how much significance this second sort of stimulation of the string is going to have, and then I have to decide what sort of a thing I want that to be. So for example, do I want this to be a noise generator, or do I want it to be a bow, or do I want to pick at the string in some way? And again, I've got a different sort of overlapping sort of list of ways in which I can get the string moving selectable here from object number 2. So if at the same time as using this impulse, I'm also going to use a bow for object 2, now what I'm going to get is this kind of initial attack, which is coming from the impulse, and then something a little bit more sustained as the bow starts to work on the sound as well. Now, if I want to hear more of that, what I can do is to turn up the amount of tension that this second object is having on the sound. Now, at the moment, we're hearing that as we let go of the string. One of those is taking over from the other. And that's because, and this is where Sculpture starts to get really significantly complicated, is that we have an opportunity to decide how that behavior is going to work. And I can see that for object 2, at the moment, the bow takes place when I let go of a key rather than when it plays in the first place. So if I select key on here instead to match the way that the first impulse is happening, we'll get both of these objects happening at once. Okay, and when I let go of the key, it kind of recovers. So now we've got these two different sort of objects making the string move in some way. Now, Sculpture is an amazingly sophisticated instrument, and we're only really just getting started. But the specifics of what I want to look at in this video is that what we can actually do with Sculpture is to bring an external sound in as an object to get the string moving. Now, to do that, we have to use object number 2. I'm going to turn off object number 1. And if I come down to object number 2, what I'm going to discover right down at the bottom is an external input for this particular sort of object. So if I select this particular sort of algorithm, if you like, this approach, what I then need to do is to tell Sculpture where that sound is coming from. This is where the sidechain input becomes important. Having selected the external object there, what I can then do is to come up into the top right-hand corner, come to the sidechain, and then what I'm going to need is to feed a signal into Sculpture. And I've got a beat loop, which is currently playing back on track 1, and I'm going to use this as the kind of stimulus for the string by selecting it here. Now, when I let go of it, what that now means is that Audio 1's beat loop is being routed into Sculpture and it's ready to start sort of working on this sound. But the only problem is at the moment, it's also going to be playing back. Which means that any notes that I play on Sculpture are going to be kind of masked by the fact that this beat loop is happening. So what I'm actually going to do is to come back to the beat loop, and I'm going to come to its stereo output routing, and I'm going to route it to no output. Now when I press play, we can see that the level is still happening internally. I can see the levels are still sort of playing, but they're no longer being routed to the stereo output. But of course, they are being routed through to Sculpture. Now I'm not going to press stop, because if I press stop, Audio 1 will no longer be effectively playing back through Sculpture. One thing to know about sidechain inputs is that they have to be active, which means that I'm going to need this to keep playing for me to be able to hear this sound. So what I'm then going to do is to come down to instrument number 1 again and start playing some notes. Okay, now at the moment we're still in this kind of glass material place. What I'm going to do is to start experimenting with some other shapes here as well. And what I'm also going to do is to put a compressor on this sound. I'm just going to use that mostly to kind of boost level a little bit so we can hear a bit more clearly what we're doing. So we'll configure these settings as we go through as well. Okay, so I'm going to drop threshold a little bit, slightly increase ratio and turn up the makeup gain. And in fact, we'll turn auto gain off. Okay, let's turn the compressor off for a moment, or just shut its interface down, I should say. And then what we can do is to start experimenting with how sounds change as we move around the material square. Okay, now you can hear that the sound is currently sort of fading out over time, and that's because of the way that the envelope here on the right-hand side is currently configured. What I'm going to do is to turn the sustain level up to maximum, and then hopefully it'll stick around as we play this sound through. Now, as we've already seen as well, I think we're going to get quite a lot of sonic difference depending on where I place the pickup. Now remember, object 2 is where we're using this external input. So what I'm going to do is to manipulate this across the line of the string and just listen back to how that actually affects things. Now what's nice towards the middle is that we just start to get this slightly more aggressive, almost distorted kind of character. I wonder how that would sound an octave lower as a kind of bass line. Too much is the answer, so I've got an overall level control here. So what we can see straight away, I can press stop now to stop the playback of the sort of audio file coming into Sculpture, is that as a kind of kick-off point for creating new sounds, if we want to make this idea of a kind of dancing groove in some way kind of stimulate this virtual string, there's a whole world of kind of sonic possibility available to us. And of course, there are a whole bunch of things we haven't even explored, including some of the extended parameters around the outside, media loss, resolution, tension mod. When you're trying these out, again, these are going to affect the behavior of the material that you choose, whether that's nylon or wood or glass or steel or some intermediate position between all of those things. So there's loads more here to explore. But in terms of setting up the idea of a kind of physical modeled instrument where we get an external sound coming in to in some way get this crazy, really interesting sound design space that Sculpture is moving in some way, I think there's just a whole sort of adventure playground of sonic possibility here.